True crime, the Lyra McKee case. Fanad Drive, the footage, and the silence. The Riot, the Gunman, and the legal gap. The Land Rover, the Riot, the missing gunman, and the evidence a court said was not enough. The police Land Rover was supposed to hold a line. On Fanad Drive in Derry, it sat inside the ordinary geography of a residential street, houses, pavement, vehicles, people watching from nearby, and a disturbance that had already pulled police, residents, onlookers, and cameras into the same narrow space. At first, the vehicle mattered because it marked where the police were. Later, it mattered because of who was standing near it. Lyra McKee had gone there as a journalist. She was not a combatant, not a rioter, not a police officer, and not the person any court would later say was meant to be hit. She was watching, recording, witnessing, doing what reporters do when a public event moves from rumor into evidence. The question that followed did not stay simple. It was not only who fired the shot. It became a harder courtroom question: whether anyone standing near the gunman could legally be proved to have encouraged or assisted him. This article follows the case through the latest confirmed legal developments as of July 5, 2026. The answer did not arrive in one clean line. It moved through mobile phone footage, video analysis, forensic material, a recovered weapon, a non-jury trial, a joint enterprise allegation, and finally a ruling that left Lyra's family still facing the same street, the same absence, and the same missing gunman. The life before the case. Lyra Catherine McKee was born in Belfast on March 31, 1990, the youngest of 6 children. Her family later described North Belfast as her home, until shortly before her death, when she began making Derry Londonderry home with her partner, Sarah Canning. Family accounts say she remained a part-time carer for her mother in Belfast and had been planning to propose to Sarah in May 2019. That human detail matters because Lyra's public life can easily be flattened into the final image of a journalist at a riot. She was also a daughter, partner, sister, aunt, carer, campaigner, and writer who had spent years trying to tell stories about lives shaped by Northern Ireland's past. Her work had already broken through. Family campaign material says she began pursuing investigative journalism as a teenager, worked as an online editor for MediaGazer from the age of 21, founded the Muckraker as a space for stories that struggled to find a home, and later secured a 2-book deal. Her 2014 blog letter to my 14-year-old self became one of the pieces most associated with her public voice. Lyra's subject was often the generation raised after the Good Friday Agreement, people old enough to inherit trauma, but young enough to expect something better. That made her death especially hard to place. She had written about the unfinished consequences of violence, and then violence made her part of the same unfinished record. The street came later. First came the work, the family, the ambition, and the belief that difficult conversations could still loosen old fear. The people around her. The public case eventually filled with names: police officers, camera crews, defendants, lawyers, judges, campaigners, paramilitary labels, and witnesses who did not or could not provide the answers investigators needed. But the private center was smaller. Lyra's partner Sarah was with her in Derry. Her family were still connected to Belfast, to her work, and to the future she was building. Family accounts describe Lyra as caring, generous, energetic, and fun-loving. They also make a point that true crime writing should not skip. She had ordinary human faults, ordinary human relationships, and a life that did not exist only to become a symbol. Around the edges of that life sat another world: dissident Republican activity, police operations, anti-police hostility, local fear, and the uneasy politics of communities still living with paramilitary pressure. The official account from Parliament said police searches were being carried out in Cregan that evening, because officers believed dissident Republicans were storing firearms and explosives ahead of planned attacks. That meant Lyra walked into a place where several versions of public life overlapped. There was the reporter's version: go, look, document. There was the police version: search, contain, survive. There was the residents' version. Watch another confrontation unfold outside homes. And there was the paramilitary version, where violence could be performed for attention, control, and fear. The case would later turn on whether the court could identify not only the gunman's act, but the legal meaning of the people around him. The first cracks. The disturbance on April 18th did not come from nowhere. Official statements said police had carried out searches at 2 locations in Cregan, and that a crowd gathered while those searches were underway. 3 vehicles were hijacked and set alight, and police came under attack with up to 50 petrol bombs thrown at police lines. That early frame is important, because it explains why the first official story was about disorder. The scene had the shape of a riot before it had the shape of a murder case. Petrol bombs, burning vehicles, police Land Rovers, masked figures, and onlookers all sat inside the same visual field. Lyra was there to observe. Court records later described evidence from a witness, Mr. Doyle, who saw a masked man extend a firearm toward the closest Land Rover and fire. He thought there was a gap before further shots, as if the weapon had jammed. Then he heard a scream. At that moment, the first crack became unmistakable. The disorder had produced a consequence beyond property damage, beyond street theater, beyond the routine violence police had expected from dissident Republican activity. The first explanation still had room to move. The intended target appeared to be police. The person struck was not a police officer. The gunman was masked. The crowd was large. The footage was imperfect. What had happened was visible enough to horrify people, but not yet clear enough to prove who could be held legally responsible. The last ordinary movements. Lyra's last ordinary movement was not a secret journey. It was public, close to police vehicles, in a street where others were also watching. She had recently moved toward a new life in Derry, Londonderry with Sarah, and the evening placed her professional instinct inside the daily geography of that city. The legal record later fixed my day. Fanad Drive and Central Drive became more than street names. The court file described a masked group, footage from the disturbance, and the prosecution allegation that 3 men had been among those accompanying the gunman toward the corner from which the shots were fired. This was the point at which ordinary public watching became a forensic problem. Who could be seen? Who could be recognized? Who was masked? What did the footage show directly? What did it only suggest? What could be inferred from movement, clothing, proximity, and timing? The court record later noted that the Crown's identification case for the murder charge rested on imagery analysis. The starting point was poor quality mobile phone footage, in which no facial features could be seen, and no identifying clothing features were visible. Analysts worked backward from that footage, comparing it with better quality material and daytime images. That is where the case began to narrow and weaken at the same time. Video could preserve movement. It could not automatically convert masked movement into identity, knowledge, intent, and legal guilt. The first alarm. The first alarm was not theoretical. Mr. Doyle's account in the court record described Lyra on the ground with Sarah beside her. He initially thought she might have been hit by a stone, then saw a wound. Local people helped place her in the footwell of a police vehicle, and the Land Rover left its speed for hospital. At hospital, Lyra was pronounced dead. The restraint of that record does not lessen it. It makes the sequence starker. A public order operation became an emergency rescue. The armored vehicle that had been a target became a vehicle used to get Lyra to medical help. Officials later said officers attended to Lyra while still under attack and transported her to hospital in a police vehicle. That detail returned again and again in the public memory of the case because it compressed the contradiction. The same police line being attacked became the route by which a journalist was taken from the street. The new IRA later admitted responsibility, saying one of its members had fired during an attack on police. That admission answered part of the public question, but not the prosecutable one. It did not identify the gunman in court. It did not prove who else, if anyone, had legally assisted him. The first alarm, therefore, opened 2 cases at once: a murder investigation into the person who fired, and a broader question about whether others around him could be brought within the law. The search for an explanation. The early explanation was politically clear, but legally incomplete. A dissident Republican gunman fired toward police. Lyra, standing nearby, was struck. Public condemnation followed quickly, and official statements treated the killing as an attack on peace, journalism, and the society Lyra represented. But an explanation is not the same as a conviction. The investigation had to move from public understanding to evidence that could survive court. That meant identifying masked people, testing footage, linking objects, recovering the weapon, and deciding whether the law could reach people who did not fire the shot. A later court judgment described the charges against several defendants arising from Riot and associated offenses on April 18, with some also facing charges linked to events 2 days earlier. Paul McIntyre, Peter Gearoyd Kavanagh, and Jordan Devine were charged with murder, but court records made clear they were not alleged to have fired the gun. The allegation was that they intentionally encouraged or assisted the gunman on a joint enterprise basis. That distinction is the hinge of the whole case. The court was not being asked simply whether Lyra was murdered. It was asked whether these defendants could be proved to have had the required role and intent as secondary parties. The evidence had to do more than place people in a chaotic street. It had to carry the legal weight of identification, assistance, encouragement, knowledge, and intent. The evidence that did not fit. The case prosecutors built drew from multiple strands: video footage, mobile phone material, forensic evidence, and imagery analysis. The Public Prosecution Service later described it as complex and challenging, and said the prosecution had been brought because its legal test was met and because it was in the public interest. One evidence strand concerned the weapon. Police later recovered the handgun used to kill Lyra, and it was linked to prior attacks. In 2022, Niall Sheeran was sentenced to 7 years in prison for possessing the gun and ammunition, but that conviction did not establish that he fired the fatal shot or participated in the murder. Another strand concerned footage. The court file shows the prosecution alleged McIntyre, Devine, and Kavanagh were masked individuals accompanying the gunman toward the corner of Fanad Drive and Central Drive. Prosecutors said McIntyre and Devine assisted by picking up misfired bullets from the ground. The defense disputed the identifications and disputed whether poor quality footage could prove assistance or encouragement. That was the evidence problem in its cleanest form. A camera can show figures moving. It can show a moment. It can show proximity. But if faces are not visible, if clothing comparison requires technical interpretation, and if intention must be inferred, the court must ask whether the accumulated evidence reaches the criminal standard. The evidence did not fail because nothing happened. It failed in the murder acquittals because what happened around the gunman could not be proved against the 3 accused men to the required legal standard. The event at the center of the case. The central event was short. Its legal consequences were not. Official accounts said the disturbance followed police searches in Cregan, during which vehicles were set alight and petrol bombs were thrown at police. During the disorder, a gunman fired shots in the direction of police. One of those shots struck Lyra as she stood near police vehicles. The court later accepted that Lyra had been murdered. Mrs. Justice Smith found that the shots were fired with murderous intent, and that there was an obvious intention to kill or seriously injure police. The intended target, on that analysis, was police. The person killed was Lyra. That finding matters, because the acquittals did not mean the court found there was no murder. They meant the court was not satisfied that the 3 defendants charged as secondary parties could be convicted of it. The legal distinction is narrow in language, but enormous in effect. For the prosecution, the allegation was that movement with the gunman, presence at the firing point, and the alleged picking up of misfired rounds supported a case of encouragement or assistance. For the defense, the footage was too poor, the identification too contested, and the inferences around intent too speculative. The law could not simply ask who was nearby. It had to ask what each accused person knew, intended, and did. The prosecution had to prove not only that the gunman had murderous intent, but that the defendants charged as secondary offenders intended to encourage or assist the deliberate infliction of serious bodily harm or death. That is why the central event remained both clear and unresolved. Lyra was murdered. The person who fired was not before the court. The question was whether the men beside or around that person could be legally tied to the act. In July 2026, the court said the evidence fell short. When the story broke open, Lyra's death moved quickly beyond Fanad Drive. Political leaders, journalists, civil society groups, and communities across Northern Ireland condemned the killing. The House of Commons statement described Lyra as a journalist and role model who wanted Northern Ireland to become a better place, and it placed her death against the fragility of peace after the Belfast Agreement. The symbolism was unavoidable, but symbolism also carries risk. It can make a case feel more solved than it is. Public grief can identify the moral wrong. It cannot identify a masked gunman in court. Public anger can condemn paramilitary violence. It cannot prove secondary liability. Lyra's family responded by campaigning. Their Justice for Lyra material described billboards, letters to homes in Cregan and surrounding areas, public appeals for information, and ongoing calls for people with video footage or knowledge to come forward. The family said the gunman continued to evade justice, and that the investigation remained active. That campaign exposed one of the case's hardest public facts. The event happened in a place with witnesses, cameras, and community knowledge, yet the legal system still did not produce a conviction for the shooting itself. The story broke open because it was not only a murder case. It became a test of whether a society that publicly rejects paramilitary violence can also produce the evidence needed to defeat the silence around it. The case built from fragments. The murder case against McIntyre, Kavanagh, and Devine was circumstantial. Court records and later statements show it relied on strands that had to be considered together: imagery analysis, mobile phone footage, better quality footage from other sources, clothing comparisons, alleged movements around the gunman, and the prosecution argument that certain actions assisted or encouraged the shooting. Circumstantial evidence is not weak by definition. A case can be proved through separate fragments if those fragments align strongly enough and exclude reasonable alternatives. But circumstantial evidence becomes vulnerable when each fragment depends on a contested inference. That was the courtroom pressure here. The prosecution said the pattern supported guilt. The defense said the pattern depended on uncertain identity, poor quality footage, and speculation about intent. The judge had already refused a defense application to stop the case at an earlier stage, finding in February 2026 that the case could continue. That did not guarantee conviction. It meant the prosecution case had passed one legal threshold before failing at the final one. The court had to distinguish between suspicion and proof. Being near a gunman is not automatically encouragement. Moving after shots are fired is not automatically assistance. Picking up objects if proved may matter, but the court still has to decide what was picked up, who did it, what they knew, and what intent can safely be inferred. The trial did not turn on one cinematic reveal. It turned on whether fragile fragments could bear the weight of a murder conviction. The outcome that did not end the story. On July 3, 2026, Paul McIntyre, Peter Kavanagh, and Jordan Gareth Devine were found not guilty of murdering Lyra McKee after a long-running non-jury trial at Belfast Crown Court. The judge ruled that the evidence was insufficient to convict them as secondary parties who had assisted or encouraged the gunman. Mrs. Justice Smith's closing words drew the legal boundary sharply. She said Lyra McKee's murder was an act of senseless violence, that the gunman had never been brought to court, and that the evidence against those accused of assisting or encouraging him had fallen short of what was required for conviction. That is what an acquittal means here. It does not erase the murder. It does not identify another person. It does not declare that the shooting did not happen. It means the prosecution did not prove the murder charge against these three men beyond the required standard. Other defendants faced riot-related charges. Established reporting from the court outcome said 4 of 6 men charged over riot-related matters were acquitted. Christopher Gillen was convicted of riot and throwing firebombs, and Kieran McCool was convicted of assaulting a community worker. The outcome therefore split the public story from the legal result. The public story still says Lyra was murdered during dissident Republican violence. The legal result says the court did not have enough to convict the 3 men accused of helping the gunman. For Lyra's family, that distinction was not comfort. It was another version of absence. The aftermath people still argue about. Outside court, Lyra's sister Nicola Corner said the family would not stop. She criticized what she called a culture of silence and said people were afraid to share information. Established reporting recorded her saying that no one among 150 witnesses had come forward in a way that delivered justice. That claim is more than anger. It points to the social architecture around the case. In communities shaped by paramilitary intimidation, silence can be a form of self-protection. It can also be the condition that allows violence to remain unresolved. Both can be true at once. Press freedom groups and journalist organizations also treated the acquittals as a warning. The National Union of Journalists said Mrs. Justice Smith had determined that Lyra was murdered, but that not guilty verdicts had been returned against the 3 accused. It also noted concern that no one had been charged with the shooting itself. The Public Prosecution Service took a different institutional position. It acknowledged the acquittals, described the case as complex, and said the decision to prosecute uses a different legal test from the test a court applies when deciding guilt. That explanation matters. Prosecutors may properly bring a case that later fails at trial. The aftermath still divides into law, grief, and public responsibility. Law asks, what can be proved? Grief asks why that is not enough. Public responsibility asks why so many people can witness violence and still leave a family without the one answer that matters most: the review, appeal, or unanswered question. As of July 5, 2026, the central unresolved question is not whether Lyra McKee was murdered. The court and public record are clear on that. The unresolved question is who fired the shot, and whether any further evidence will ever bring the gunman, or anyone legally responsible for assisting him, before a court. The gun itself has already passed through the legal record. A man was sentenced in 2022 for possessing the weapon and ammunition. But possession of the gun at a later point is not the same as proof of firing it on Fanad Drive, and it did not resolve the murder. That is one of the case's core misconceptions. Some summaries treat the recovered weapon as if it solved the case. It did not. It narrowed the file, showed continuity between violent activity and the fatal shot, and produced one prosecution for possession. But the person who pulled the trigger has not been convicted. There is also a misconception about the acquittals. An acquittal is not a public certificate that nothing suspicious occurred. It is a legal decision that the charge was not proved. In this case, it means the court was not satisfied that these 3 men could be convicted of murder on the evidence presented. The remaining question is whether silence can be broken by evidence strong enough to matter in court, not only in memory. Why the Land Rover still matters. The Land Rover still matters because it carries the whole contradiction of the case. It was the object being attacked. It was the point near which Lyra stood. It was part of the reason the gunman fired. It became the vehicle that took her away from Fanad Drive. In the court record, it is not a symbol invented after the fact. It is part of the physical sequence that turned a riot into a murder investigation. Lyra's life should not be reduced to that vehicle, that street, or that final movement. She was a writer who wanted hard conversations to mean something. She was a partner planning a future. She was a daughter and sister whose family still has to speak about justice in public because the person who fired has not been brought before a court. The acquittals make the case harder, not smaller. They force a distinction between moral certainty and legal proof, between public outrage and admissible evidence, between what a community may believe and what a court can safely find. That distinction can feel cold. It is also the line that keeps criminal justice from becoming accusation by atmosphere. The tragedy of Lyra McKee is that the same line now protects the standard of proof while leaving her family without the person who fired the shot. Fanad Drive was never only a street. It became a test of what a society can see, what it can say, and what it can prove.